Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius report. Well, the ECB fears that the U.S. could allow European banks to collapse. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion, and there are certainly some desperate things going on in the European financial system.
Yeah, well, first off, great joining as well, Ken, and people will listen to that headline and go, I don't believe this. Well, you don't need to believe us because it's factually correct. Now, this may seem a bit puzzling because the argument would be, well, why would Europe fear this was going to happen? Because the argument quite correctly would say, well, if European banks were to go down, the United States or US banks, UK banks would go down as well, and that's absolutely correct. But what is factually correct is the European Central Bank are actually looking across the entire Eurozone and telling regional lenders in these countries to assess, okay, what are your needs to hold US dollars if there is a period of stress in the financial system, basically. Now we know, and we've talked extensively on these podcasts, I've talked about it for years, about all the problems. And this relates to their accessibility to US dollars. So they're not talking about their accessibility to euros. Now, approximately about 20% of Eurozone banks' funding needs are actually denominated in US dollars. So what that therefore means is if you were to have a problem in the future, a systemic event, financial event, and you need some injection of short-term funding, there, because lenders would be borrowing in markets for that purpose, then that might not be available. So if European banks borrowed dollars as they would have done from the Fed to make up the shortfall, this is what these swap lines relate to. And historically, the argument will be, well, that's not a problem. Well, suddenly, the European Central Bank regard this as being the problem. Now, the argument would go, well, the Fed has the swap lines with the ECB and other central banks, which would be for the sole purpose of if there were shortages of the US dollar, then they would provide them. And the purpose of that is so fundamentally Europe wouldn't blow up, because if Europe blows up, then the financial contagion, of course, is going to spill into the United States because banks have never been more interconnected, or as I use that crude term, lassoed together since 2008. Now, one has to come and say, well, has the Fed ever suggested they wouldn't provide those backstops? Well, the answer thus far is no. But then the question is, why is the ECB requesting that lenders across the entire Eurozone start to look at problems they have in their balance sheets? I mean, for example, where they obviously lend out dollars and other, to maybe clients within the banks, or financed dollar denominated assets, but they don't have sufficient funding in the dollar to handle the liabilities. So if they've got gaps in their balance sheets, problems with them, they're going to have to do something to resolve those problems. Now, I'm sure the election of Trump has made things infinitely worse. And the whole problem with the tariff policies is clearly something that's going to concern the European Central Bank. It's interesting how much money has moved out of the United States and US dollar denominated assets, the dumping of treasuries, and has moved into European banks, into the euro, into German bonds, for example. This is a statement of fact as well. We've seen this in probably the last 6, 7, 8 weeks or so. So there has been a precedent for this to happen. But obviously, if there are shortfalls in the balance sheets of European banks, then they're going to have to deal with those. And the European and central bank saying you have to make sure you're dealing with those and ensure it's not a problem in the future. Now, the interesting thing is when asked to comment on these statements, and the European Central Bank wouldn't comment on it. No one in the US would. No one in the Trump administration would comment on it. The Fed wouldn't comment on it, merely going, well, we've always said, if there's a need for dollars, the dollars will always be available. Well, you start to listen to comments like that and you think, well, to coin a phrase, there's no smoke without fire. And I'll give way to you, Ken.
Yeah, for those who don't remember, back in 2010, we obviously had the financial crisis and the banking crisis in the US in 2008. But in 2010, Europe started having its sovereign debt crisis, and Bernanke jumped in and sets the swap lines to help in that crisis. And it's an estimated, and you may have different numbers, but it's estimated that $40 trillion was involved in the swap lines and saving the European banks. And I remember one of the fascinating things is I remember some of the names of some of the banks that were under this massive stress. The Spanish bank Santander, for one. And ironically, I heard recently that Santander now has become one of the more powerful banks in Europe, maybe surpassing Deutsche Bank or all the problems going on with UBS, Credit Suisse, etc. But the reality is that the Fed has been pushing the swap line and kept it going for ever since 2010. And one of the things you're seeing from Trump is that he is more than willing to use the dollar as a weapon to push his tariff and trade policies. So when Trump came into office early on, we saw that the dollar and the DXY fell to 97. And I think you mentioned before we came on that the euro got as high as 117. What really caused this out of nowhere? Was it just simply fear that Trump was going to do, or was there something more at play in regards to this? And so it's really fascinating that Europe is perhaps, especially since they are lowering rates while the Fed is not doing anything, if we're suddenly seeing the potential of capital moving into Europe where Trump wants capital to move into the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no doubt we've spoken about this. I think we've done this on here. I've certainly done it on my own podcast where the Europeans for several months have been talking about can we rely on the United States in the future in financial terms? Are the risks in the financial system that could pose problems for European banks? And as we said, European banks, well, about 20% of them obviously have significant exposure to the US dollar. I mean, and therefore, this is not something that is a new issue, but it's now, I think, deemed to be more of a critical concern or a significant concern. I mean, and, therefore, nobody's actually come out and said, well, the Fed won't respond or the US won't respond. And the argument is there's no stress in dollar funding markets at the moment. Well, what happens when, we've seen the 10-year Treasury now yield at 4.5%, the 30 years heading towards 5%, we're going to start getting into critical territory. I think there are stresses in the dollar funding system. And therefore, this is not unreasonable to be concerned about it. There's no doubt. I think European banks as well are starting to assign a risk to the belief that, well, maybe Fed funding won't be available. And I think the level of risk, it's all relative compared to what it might have been 6 months ago, a year ago, is significantly greater now than it was. That will be in relation to the risk of dollar shortages. And therefore, the argument's going to be, well, banks are going to have to work on the basis, as weird or unbelievable as this is, because they're talking about it. This is again a statement of facts. We're not speculating here. The Fed swap lines in the future, for whatever reason, might not be available. So then the argument would be that you have to get out of these positions where you're heavily exposed to dollars or dollar denominated asset. So you need to reduce your exposure in that case. That might go some way to explaining why there has been a move as well out of the dollar, out of dollar denominated asset, because if you're a financial institution in Europe, then you might want to start moving your assets out of dollars into euros. This stacks up with all the things we've seen in recent weeks. I mean, and therefore, there is clear evidence that would support this perspective. And therefore, they're going to have to clean up their balance sheet. This might be exactly what they're doing in institutions, and why we've seen things that were very unexpected. I mean, it's one thing Chinese institutions selling up US dollar denominated assets or dumping US treasuries. It's another thing where you would see a European bank, for example, dumping US dollar denominated assets and buying up German bonds, for example, which we've clearly seen. So, if you're going to reduce your dollar denominated liabilities, you would have to change some of the bank's business line activities. I mean, and therefore, you also have to assess what is your bank's exposure to dollars. What could cause a liquidity imbalance in your balance sheet and start to undermine your bank? So I think there is enough evidence to suggest that we have to take this seriously, and not like people will do and dismiss it. Now, I think, for me, I think that's a very high level, 30,000-foot view of the situation. Then the question is, what's the ramifications of this, and why might institutions or the ECB or banking institutions or other, institutions feel that this is a genuine fear that this might not happen, or these swap lines might not be available in the future. And I think that's probably, a good point to move on to. But obviously, I'll give way to you, Ken, and you can finish off in this sort of segment, as it were.
Yeah, one of the more interesting things that's may or may not be tied to it, but it's definitely going to have some ramifications, is I think the U.S. is finally having to recognize that their debt problem, not just the national debt, but what the entirety of being the reserve currency, being tied to, I think it's still 95 currencies out there. The old saying that when the United States sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. If the U.S. is finally having to deal with its debt problems, and Trump is pursuing a combination of a strong dollar plus having capital come back into the United States rather than outward, which has been what the norm has been under this reserve currency scheme, Tiffin's paradox. You cannot be a industrial and debtor nation and have the reserve currency. You need the world to want dollars and continuously want dollars and increasingly want dollars if you're going to keep your world reserve currency status and not have that inflation come into your backyard. So if Trump, there's two things that he's introducing, at least it appears to, introducing cuts in the bank's capital requirements. In essence, The things that caused the 2008 global financial crisis, we'll just, the banks have learned their lesson. We'll just give them more, more of a leash. And the other thing is that the banks are more and more not actually putting money into economies. They're putting more into speculation, the old financialization rule of trying to keep asset prices inflated. The Fed, in the meantime, is holding tight to not cutting rates and wanting to, up to a point, deal with their balance sheet. So there's not the expectation that they're going to be printing more dollars to go out into the world. So with that being said, we also have some discomfort from the European auditors as they recognize that the U.S. is potentially going to lessen the requirements and restrictions for auditing of the dollar system, or at least the banking system and the dollar. I think what was it they were talking about? Yeah, oversight of the accounting firms when it comes to the financial system and the dollar-based system itself. So you have a lot of things that are being loosened at a time when the offer, or where it looks like Trump is trying to tighten things, and it's causing a lot of confusion for nations that require and need a nice, easy flowing dollar system, as we saw in 2010 when the US started tightening things after the global financial crisis. It was a big part of what led to the European financial crisis, sovereign debt crisis of 2010.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. The other thing, of course, is the US can't tighten anything. The US is going to print like there's no tomorrow. I mean, people might not want to believe that or don't believe it to be true, but they'll have no choice in the end. But the issue, as far as Europe's concerned, is Europe, rather like the rest of the world, is going, well, Trump might weaponize the dollar. Tariffs could cause us major problems. It could also be that there is this now understanding in Europe that the dollar's becoming a massive liability. It's a huge problem because the US is never going to deal with its debt problem. This debt problem is going to spiral more and more out of control. The budget deficit's going to rise, which it will do. And therefore, the idea of wanting to hold dollars, not least because of the weaponization, is becoming a situation that they just now realize that if there is a problem inside the United States, then we need to do everything we can to mitigate the risks in holding dollars or dollar denominated assets could be. And therefore, we need to start taking action in doing so. It's also entirely possible that the United States might try and weaponize the swap lines to force the Europeans to behave themselves as the United States feels they should do with regards to these tariffs and tariff rates and tariff policies. It's entirely possible the United States is trying to assert that kind of control. I'm not saying it's happening, but it's a possibility. So it could work one of two ways, but clearly the Europeans are getting very uncomfortable with holding dollars and dollar denominated assets. It's absolutely clear because there was a bit of a, well, who's dumping dollar assets? Who's dumping US treasuries and buying European bonds and European or euro denominated assets, etc.? Well, I think it's very clear. It's going to be institutions and no doubt banks who want to precisely mitigate the big holes they may have in their balance sheet to with regards to dollar denominated assets, are doing precisely what the European Central Bank's advising them to do, and to mitigate what they perceive to be the risks and the holes that may exist in their balance sheet. Now, there is another side to this I think we have to mention with regards to the whole swap lines thing. I mean, and what are the consequences if the United States withheld swap line? Assuming, and that's again, back to this issue, well, we had the pandemic in 2020, and the Europeans just printed trillions and trillions of euros. So the argument is, do they actually need these swap lines in the future? And okay, there's people who go, well, what do you do with handling dollar denominated assets in that regard? Well, if you're having to bail everything out and you have to print trillions of euros, well, what's a few more trillion euros you can print instead of having to use swap lines? Maybe. I mean, we're talking about extreme cases, so that's a possibility. But for argument's sake, the Fed could withhold, swap lines. The consequences would be you get loads of EU banks, also US banks would suddenly have huge holes in their balance sheets. Now, if that happens, then you start blowing European banks up, you blow US banks are in the process of withholding swap lines. You'd blow your own banks up in the process. You don't want to do that. Now, there might be idiots in the Beltway who don't comprehend such things. I can't imagine the Fed's going to sit there and go, well, we can't comprehend this. I know the Fed makes some very bizarre decisions, but this is as basic as it gets, although we shouldn't assume anyone has anything remotely approaching basic intelligence in this regard. So it might just as well be that the belief inside Europe is the problem is going to be so massive. What swap lines are the Fed going to provide? I mean, we're going to have trillions of swaps needed. I mean, again, what's the ramifications? So if you think the chaos inside the US financial system is going to be so great, okay, you're not going to solve the problem, but you would start to say you need to mitigate this as fast as possible. Now, the question is if this is indeed the objective, and it seems to be, we should see this continuation of capital leaving the United States, leaving dollar-denominated assets, leaving US Treasuries and piling into European or euro-denominated assets in bonds, German bonds, whatever. Instead, and that pattern should continue, and that would be an affirmation of precisely what is going on. But this, as I said, is a statement of fact. There has been warnings. The European Central Bank is clearly concerned. So what we're saying isn't speculation, it's fact. The only thing we're trying to understand better is why precisely would they be doing this? And I think in a very high level way, we've made some assessments as to what those reasons could be.
Yeah, and I think we potentially need to talk about the elephant in the room. The world is moving towards de-dollarization, bilateral trade, multipolar trade. Uh, China in the future is not going to want to deal with Europe in dollars. And so when you take a look at what European nations, who are they going to want to be doing trade and business with? Are they going to want to have to? Because remember Trump early on in his in the start of his second presidency here came out publicly and said not only do nations have to use the dollar, and the dollar is going to remain the world reserve currency into infinity, but he's also inferred that if nations ditch the dollar, then he will go after anyone that wants to do this. If you trade with China or Russia or another or whomever in their bilateral currencies and you bypass the dollar, then we're going to go after you personally. So how much of an extent is that, or is it just bloviating a threat, a saber rattling threat? But the reality is that the world is changing. We're at the 50 some odd year, nearly 53-year point of a fiat reserve currency and an entire world that's worked on a fiat reserve currency. There's been more and more talk about the Great Reset. And that Great Reset, of course, it depends on who is saying it, but it's being said by multiple different sources. And I think the recognition is that the Bretton Woods system that's been around for 80 years is quickly going away, and that nations need, and in this case, the continent needs to be prepared to be able to transition into a new system. And that's one of the reasons why there is more and more talk, too, about expanding the internationalization of the euro beyond just the borders of the continent as a means to do bilateral trade and, of course, to be outside the dollar.
Oh, yeah, and it could be, yes. And just a very final point for me on this is, I'm I'm not suggesting this will happen, should happen. I'm not suggesting the euro is a stronger currency than the dollar. Absolutely not. But it could be a situation where for the Europeans, it might be in their interest in the future to say to the Southeast Asian countries, well, you can trade in euros with us. And to some extent they do. This is not, we have to be careful here because the euro, or what's reported in terms of trade done in euros, is massively underreported because of SEPA, which is a system they use for euro transactions, and it's not in SWIFT, and SWIFT doesn't account for all transactions made in euro. But who knows? Does whether this actually materialize in the future or not? But the Europeans might be sat there going, well, we're going to have to start looking after our own currency. We're going to have to start putting measures in place. And maybe it's less we think, can we rely on the Fed in the future? The question might be, we'd rather not have to rely on the Fed and the swap lines at all, but that's not realistic. But we need to reduce our exposure to the dollar for all the reasons we've just explained in this podcast today.
Yeah, absolutely. And remember, after the GFC, the Great Financial Crisis, banks lashed themselves together. That made them stronger, but it means if one goes down, they all go down. And so they've been able to save and protect themselves because banks, will rush in to help one another to keep the stability of the system. You know, I'm reminded, closing remark. I'm reminded of John Connolly, former Treasury Secretary. When asked about the dollar, he said, "It's our privilege, but it's your problem." And I think maybe Europe and a number of different entities in the world are suddenly recognizing that we don't want to deal with that problem anymore. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion and for all of your insight.
Yes, likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you, as always, for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.